Hey guys, tonight we drift back before oceans, before even the Earth itself had a name. Imagine the early universe, a vast darkness filled only with clouds of hydrogen and helium spun from the Big Bang. Stars ignited in that dark, and within their blazing hearts the elements of water were born. Each star lived and died, scattering oxygen through space in brilliant supernova. Those ancient stellar explosions forged the oxygen atoms that would one day pair with hydrogen to form the first water molecules. Long before our planet existed, the ingredients for oceans were floating in the cold void, waiting. Now picture a swirling nebula, the raw cradle of our solar system. Dust and ice grains collided, stuck together, and grew into planetesimals, tiny worlds in the making. Among them drifted countless icy comets, silent couriers of water. As the young Earth took shape about 4.5 billion years ago, it was a violent newborn, a sphere of molten rock hammered by meteorites and asteroids. Many of those impacts carried water ice locked inside stone. Each collision was a cosmic delivery, a spark in the grand recipe. Bit by bit, those icy fragments delivered vast stores of hydrogen and oxygen to a planet still glowing red. Scientists still debate how much of our water came from comets and how much from deep within Earth's own mantle. Some evidence suggests that volatile-rich asteroids, called carbonaceous chondrites, were the main carriers, while others argue that the infant Earth held more water internally than we once believed, locked in minerals that later released it as steam. Whichever the balance, the outcome was the same. Earth was seeded with water long before the first ocean shimmered. Think for a moment about that strange inheritance. The glass of water on your nightstand is ancient beyond measure. Every molecule in it was forged in stars billions of years ago, long before there was even a sun to shine on this planet. When you drink, you're connecting with a cosmic past, with hydrogen older than any mountain, with oxygen born in long-dead stars. That is the first chapter of the ocean story. Not a blue planet yet, but a universe quietly preparing the ingredients of seas to come. In those timeless stretches, gravity gathered dust and gas into a spinning disk. At the center, our sun ignited. Around it, planets condensed. Earth emerged from chaos, but it was still far from the world we know. Above its molten surface, space itself was already rich with the water that would define our planet's character. The history of the oceans begins out there, in the silent depths of the cosmos, with the patient dance of stars creating the very elements of life. As the newborn Earth cooled, the heavy bombardment of space rocks continued for hundreds of millions of years. Each strike cracked the crust and released steam, while volcanic eruptions vented gases from deep inside the mantle. Water vapor gathered in the thick, hot atmosphere, swirling with carbon dioxide and nitrogen. Imagine standing on that ancient surface, though you couldn't breathe the air. The ground is a mosaic of lava fields, glowing rivers of molten rock under a dark red sky. Above, clouds of steam churn and flash with constant lightning. There is no blue yet, only fiery orange and black. But in the atmosphere, droplets begin to form. Over time, the relentless rain begins. It pours for ages, not days or years, but millions of years of ceaseless downpour. The surface hisses as the water hits hot rock, turning instantly to vapor, condensing again, and falling once more. Slowly the planet's crust hardens. Basins form, rain collects in low places, pooling into vast, simmering lakes. These first proto-oceans are nothing like today's seas. They are acidic, heavy with dissolved minerals, and constantly reshaped by asteroid impacts that can boil them away in an instant. Yet with each cycle of destruction and replenishment, the water deepens. Eventually the bombardment eases. The sky clears enough for sunlight to strike the surface, and the planet cools. By about 4 billion years ago, true oceans cover Earth, reflecting a pale young sun. In their depths, chemistry stirs, simple molecules meeting, breaking apart, and combining in ways that hint at life's future arrival. Every glassy wave today is a continuation of that primordial rain. The salt on your skin after a swim carries whispers of those ancient storms. The ocean you know, the one that shapes climate, feeds billions, and dazzles in endless blues, was born from fire and stone, from comets and stars, and from rains that fell before any eye could see them. This is how the story of Earth's oceans begins, a cosmic inheritance, a planet cooled by eons of storm, and a surface that traded flame for water until blue became the colour of home. By the time the planet settled into a steadier rhythm, roughly 3.8 billion years ago, the young oceans stretched wide and deep, a vast global basin shimmering beneath a dim sun. These waters were far from the calm blue we know. They were greenish, heavy with dissolved iron and minerals leached from volcanic crust, and their tides were far stronger than today's, pulled by a moon far closer to Earth. Volcanoes dotted the early continents, small, unstable fragments of crust rather than the large landmasses we recognise now. Their eruptions poured minerals and gases into the atmosphere, thickening the blanket of carbon dioxide and methane that trapped heat, and kept the planet from freezing beneath a faint, cooler sun. Storms swept across the oceans with relentless force, stirring nutrients and shaping the first global weather patterns. Deep beneath the waves, an unseen drama unfolded. Hydrothermal vents spewed mineral-rich fluids into the darkness, their black chimneys shimmering with heat. Around these vents, something extraordinary was happening. The assembly of life's first building blocks. Simple molecules met and joined in the vent's warm, chemical-rich soup. Energy from the Earth's interior and the mixing of cold ocean water with superheated minerals created an ideal cradle for chemistry to experiment. No plants or fish swam here yet. Only the earliest microbial ancestors, microscopic cells that found ways to capture energy from their environment. They left no sound, no motion visible to the eye, only traces in ancient rocks that scientists read like faint signatures. Above the surface, the atmosphere remained toxic to anything like us, but the oceans were beginning their long partnership with life. Water circulated heat around the planet, buffered extreme temperatures, and carried the ingredients that would eventually spark complex biology. Slowly, the planet's chemistry shifted. Rain and rivers carried minerals from young continents into the oceans, changing their colour and texture. Iron dissolved in the water began to react with the oxygen released by early photosynthetic microbes, creating vast bands of rust-red rock that still stripe cliffs today. These banded iron formations are ancient signatures of life's first big experiment, breathing. As oxygen levels crept upward, the seas transformed. The green tint faded, and the water began to take on the clearer blues we recognise. Currents formed, circulating heat and nutrients across the globe. Tides, pulled by a closer moon, surged higher and stronger than now, carving shorelines and shaping early coastlines. In these evolving oceans, microbial mats clung to rocks, trapping sediments and building the first reefs, low mounds of life that stabilized shorelines and created microhabitats. Tiny plankton floated in the upper layers, turning sunlight into energy and releasing more oxygen. The ocean became both cradle and engine, a system that regulated climate, stored carbon, and supported a growing web of chemistry and biology. Every wave carried the potential for change. From these waters would rise the ancestors of all complex life, but for now the stage belonged to single-celled pioneers. Their quiet work, splitting water, exhaling oxygen, binding minerals, reshaped the planet far more profoundly than any later creature. The first true seas were no longer just a setting. They had become an active force, preparing Earth for the incredible diversity that lay ahead. The oceans became a vast laboratory of possibilities, their waters rich with dissolved minerals and the faint warmth of a young sun. In these endless basins, the first great biological experiments unfolded. For billions of years, Earth had been a silent world of rock, water, and single-celled microbes, but now those microbes began to push past their limits. Along shallow coastlines, mats of cyanobacteria trapped fine grains of sediment, building rounded structures known as stromatolites. They looked like lumpy stone mushrooms rising from tidal flats, but each layer recorded the slow, patient work of tiny organisms capturing sunlight and releasing oxygen. These early builders left fossils that still survive in a few remote bays of modern Australia and the Bahamas, proof that life was already shaping geology. Inside the water column, other microbes discovered ways to use energy more efficiently. Some evolved the internal structures that mark the first eukaryotic cells, the ancestors of everything from algae to animals. Others formed loose colonies, small cooperatives that hinted at the idea of multicellular bodies. Scientists debate the exact timing of these breakthroughs, but each step was a quiet revolution that expanded what life could be. As oxygen spread, the chemistry of the sea shifted. Iron that once kept the waters green and murky oxidized and fell as bands of rust to the seafloor, turning the oceans a deeper, clearer blue. This great oxidation event would eventually transform the atmosphere as well, laying the groundwork for complex organisms that needed more than a trickle of air. In this half of the story, you can picture the oceans as a canvas slowly brightening, the quiet surface hiding an invisible drama of invention and adaptation. Over countless millennia, these small changes gathered force. The new eukaryotic cells began to diversify, developing internal skeletons of proteins and intricate membranes that allowed them to grow larger and interact in more complex ways. Some engulfed smaller cells that became permanent partners, ancestors of mitochondria and chloroplasts, creating the symbiotic engines that still power plants and animals today. This quiet alliance was one of life's greatest leaps, turning simple microbes into elaborate living factories capable of storing more energy and supporting bigger bodies. In deeper waters, colonies of these new cells formed filaments and spheres, drifting like tiny living lanterns. They absorbed sunlight and nutrients, releasing more oxygen, slowly transforming the chemistry of the planet. Sediments rich in iron turned to stone as oxygen bonded with metals, creating the distinctive red and black layers known as banded iron formations. Each stripe of rock we find today is a time capsule, a signal of the slow bloom of oxygen that once filled ancient seas. The ripple effects were immense. With oxygen came ozone, a thin shield that began to protect the surface from harsh ultraviolet light. Shallow lagoons and tidal flats became safer places for delicate cells to explore new forms. Some scientists think this era set the stage for the eventual rise of multicellular life hundreds of millions of years later. Imagine drifting above those early oceans as dusk settles. The water glows faintly under a sky still richer in carbon dioxide than oxygen. Below, countless microscopic lights flicker with chemical activity. There are no fish, no plants, no animals, only a restless, invisible energy, a promise of the worlds to come. As eukaryotic life spread and multiplied, the slow trickle of oxygen became a flood. What began as subtle traces dissolved in seawater eventually transformed the very atmosphere. Scientists call this pivotal shift the Great Oxidation Event, and it was nothing less than a planetary revolution. Before it, Earth's skies were tinged with methane and carbon dioxide, a hazy orange that filtered the sun. Afterward, the air began to clear and blue skies emerged, announcing a new chemical era. Oxygen was both gift and hazard. For early microbes that had evolved without it, the gas was toxic. Entire populations of anaerobic organisms perished or retreated into oxygen-free environments, deep sediments, volcanic vents, and underground aquifers, where some of their descendants still dwell today. But for others, oxygen opened doors to astonishing possibilities. With its potent energy, cells could generate far more power, allowing them to grow larger, move faster, and develop more complex internal machinery. The oceans mirrored this transformation. Iron dissolved in ancient waters reacted with oxygen, falling as rust-red sediments that still paint cliffs and canyon walls in places like Western Australia and Canada. Each band of ironstone is a silent record of a moment when the seas briefly brimmed with oxygen before life consumed it again, a planetary heartbeat captured in rock. Above the waves, volcanic islands wore new colours as weathering minerals oxidized. Storms washed fresh nutrients into the seas, feeding microscopic plankton that thrived on the enriched chemistry. With oxygen came ozone, a protective shield in the upper atmosphere that softened the sun's ultraviolet glare and allowed fragile new organisms to venture closer to the surface light. These changes set the stage for future multicellular life. Without this grand re-engineering of the atmosphere and oceans, the diversity of plants and animals we know today could never have arisen. The Great Oxidation was more than an environmental shift. It was the spark that would eventually lead to the complex, bustling ecosystems of later eons. The surge of oxygen reshaped not only biology, but geology itself. As the seas absorbed and released oxygen in rhythmic pulses, minerals formed in new patterns. Manganese nodules and iron-rich layers locked away chemical evidence of this transformation, creating a mineral archive that scientists read today like pages of an ancient diary. Each stratum of rock preserves a time when oxygen levels fluctuated, revealing how the planet breathed during this great transition. With higher oxygen, early eukaryotes began experimenting with form and function. Some cells learned to live in cooperative colonies, passing signals and sharing resources. These simple alliances were the earliest whispers of multicellularity. Eventually, certain groups developed specialized cells for movement, feeding, or reproduction, innovations that would echo through evolution for billions of years. Meanwhile, the skies above were no longer the same. A faint blue haze gave way to clearer light as methane was broken apart, allowing the sun to shine through with greater clarity. This increase in sunlight penetration warmed some regions and cooled others, altering currents and weather patterns. Oceans mixed more vigorously, spreading nutrients and carrying oxygen to greater depths, further accelerating the cycle of change. Yet this newfound abundance also brought instability. As life drew energy from oxygen, carbon dioxide cycles shifted. Ice sheets waxed and waned in response, and the Earth entered its first great glaciations, snowball episodes where ice stretched nearly to the equator. These frigid intervals tested life's resilience, but each thaw brought a burst of evolutionary innovation, pushing organisms to adapt and diversify. By the close of this epoch, the Earth had remade itself. What began as a planet cloaked in haze had transformed into a world of blue skies, rust-red rocks, and seas alive with oxygen. From this crucible of change would rise the ancestors of plants and animals, ready to explore new possibilities in the chapters to come. With the atmosphere rich in oxygen and the oceans stirred by shifting currents, Earth entered a new chapter of biological possibility. Shallow seas became laboratories of complexity, hosting organisms that were no longer just single cells drifting aimlessly, but communities of life beginning to organize and specialize. Mats of cyanobacteria still clung to tidal flats, but now they shared space with larger, more intricate eukaryotic algae. Their green and red pigments caught the sunlight, weaving energy into food chains that could sustain more than microscopic grazers. In these nutrient-rich waters, soft-bodied organisms expanded their reach. Colonies of cells began differentiating into tissues, and multicellular life experimented with shapes beyond simple spheres or filaments. Some stretched into ribbon-like forms to capture more sunlight, while others developed rudimentary internal channels to move nutrients. Fossil impressions from this time reveal strange fronds and quilted bodies, some resembling delicate leaves pressed into stone. Though fragile, these early multicellular organisms hinted at the complexity to come, where cooperation between cells would spark the evolution of animals. Geological forces added their own energy to this transformation. Continents slowly shifted, creating shallow continental shelves bathed in warm sunlight. Rivers carried minerals from rising mountains into coastal waters, enriching the seas with phosphorus and iron. These nutrients fueled blooms of algae that in turn supported more diverse food webs. Periodic volcanic eruptions added pulses of carbon dioxide, subtly warming the climate and stirring ocean currents that distributed heat and oxygen across the globe. Predation, still in its infancy, began to influence evolution. Some microscopic creatures evolved hard outer coatings of calcium phosphate or silica, a preview of shells and skeletons. Others developed simple sensors to detect movement or light, allowing them to evade threats or seek prey. These early adaptations marked the dawn of an evolutionary arms race that would later define the Cambrian period. The oceans of this era were neither barren nor fully familiar. They were places of quiet innovation, where simple cooperation between cells set the stage for animals, and where chemical and geological changes pushed life toward complexity. From these subtle experiments, the first recognizable ecosystems were beginning to form, laying the groundwork for the dazzling diversification that would soon follow. As millions of years passed, the quiet experiments of early multicellular organisms deepened in both variety and complexity. Colonial algae evolved more efficient ways to capture sunlight, forming intricate networks that turned shallow bays into vibrant green oases. Simple sponges, among the earliest true animals, anchored themselves to rocky seafloors, filtering vast volumes of water through their porous bodies. These sponges created pockets of shelter for tiny microbes and protozoans, inadvertently building the first microhabitats of the ocean. Chemical signatures preserved in ancient rocks tell us that oxygen levels in the oceans were climbing steadily, allowing larger organisms to thrive. With more oxygen came the possibility of more energy, and with more energy came the potential for movement. Certain single-celled predators developed whip-like appendages to glide through the water, hunting smaller cells with new precision. Others became adept at detecting faint chemical trails, an early prelude to the senses that animals would one day refine into sight and smell. Life at this time was still fragile. A sudden shift in climate or a drop in oxygen could wipe out entire lineages, and indeed many vanished without leaving a trace. But each challenge spurred innovation. Organisms that could adapt to fluctuating conditions, tolerating changes in salinity, temperature, or nutrient levels, passed their traits forward. This slow but relentless filtering helped shape the genetic toolkit that later animals would inherit. Meanwhile, the continents continued their slow dance. Tectonic forces raised new mountain chains, releasing minerals into rivers and enriching coastal seas. Ocean currents shifted, mixing surface waters with nutrient-rich depths. These processes fertilized algae blooms and sustained a rich microbial soup that nourished early planktonic animals. In this interplay of geology and biology, the stage was quietly set for an unprecedented leap in complexity. By the close of this era, the oceans were no longer mere cradles of microbial mats. They had become testing grounds for multicellular life, teeming with organisms that filtered, grazed, and hunted on a microscopic scale. The innovations of these ancient waters, oxygen-rich environments, primitive predation, the first stable food webs, would ignite the Cambrian explosion that lay ahead. The seas, once silent, were now humming with possibility, ready for the surge of life that would define the next great chapter in Earth's history. Around 541 million years ago, Earth's oceans crossed a remarkable threshold. What had been a world of mostly microscopic, softly bodied organisms suddenly erupted into a riot of complexity and form, a period we now call the Cambrian explosion. In an astonishingly brief interval of geologic time, life diversified into a dizzying array of creatures with hard shells, jointed limbs and keen senses. It was as if evolution, after eons of slow experimentation, suddenly discovered an entire new palette of possibilities and began to paint wildly across the seafloor. The seas shimmered with clarity, rich in oxygen and nutrients that supported rapid innovation. Trilobites scuttled across sandy plains, their armoured bodies gleaming in the filtered light. They possessed some of the first sophisticated eyes, compound lenses that could detect predators and prey with unprecedented sharpness. Nearby, soft-bodied worms burrowed into sediment, creating labyrinths of tunnels that reshaped the ocean floor and recycled nutrients. Above them, strange jellyfish-like organisms pulsed in gentle rhythms, their translucent bells catching glints of sunlight as they drifted. Among the most striking of these new arrivals were the predators. Anomalocaris, a swift and formidable hunter, glided through the water with segmented grace, its spiny appendages reaching out to snatch unsuspecting prey. Its circular, plate-like mouth was powerful enough to crack the shells of trilobites, making it one of the first apex predators on Earth. The emergence of such hunters forever changed the dynamics of life. Prey species evolved thicker shells and quicker reflexes. Eyes grew more complex. Speed and cunning became critical advantages. This predator-prey arms race fueled a cascade of evolutionary innovations. Skeletons hardened, muscles strengthened, nervous systems grew more sophisticated. The simple microbial mats of earlier oceans gave way to bustling ecosystems layered with grazers, filter feeders, scavengers, and predators. Food webs grew intricate, weaving countless species into an interdependent network that spanned from the sunlit surface to the darkest depths. As continents shifted and shallow seas expanded, these vibrant marine communities spread widely, leaving a rich fossil record that still captivates scientists today. The Cambrian period was not merely a step forward, it was a leap. Life's blueprint broadened dramatically, and nearly all major animal groups we know today trace their origins to this astonishing burst of creativity beneath ancient waves. In the warm shallows of Cambrian seas, entire ecosystems thrived in ways that would shape the planet for the rest of its history. Reefs of early sponges and algae rose like intricate underwater fortresses, creating habitats for countless small creatures. Trilobites crawled in herds across these reefs, leaving delicate trackways that would fossilize into patterns we can still read today. their molting shells scattered across the seafloor, silent evidence of growth and change. Other organisms took to the water column, mastering the art of swimming freely. Tiny arthropods darted through the currents, their many legs beating like the wings of a miniature fleet. Early mollusks grazed on microbial films, scraping nutrients from rocks and sand. Some creatures evolved gills fine enough to draw oxygen efficiently from the ocean, while others experimented with stiff internal supports, the faint beginnings of backbones that would one day define fish, and eventually all vertebrates. What makes the Cambrian explosion so striking is its speed. In just a few tens of millions of years, a blink in geological terms, life diversified more dramatically than in any period before or since. Fossils from sites like the Burgess Shale in Canada and Xinjiang in China reveal an astonishing array of body plans, many so bizarre that early paleontologists struggle to classify them. Some of these creatures, with their frilled appendages and armoured plates, seem almost otherworldly, as though the ocean were testing every conceivable design. Scientists still debate the exact triggers for this evolutionary surge. Perhaps rising oxygen levels enabled larger, more active organisms. Perhaps the development of predation sparked an evolutionary arms race. Perhaps a combination of shifting climates, chemical changes, and genetic innovations set the stage. Whatever the cause, the result was undeniable. Earth's oceans transformed from relatively simple microbial realms into complex interconnected worlds teeming with movement and colour. By the close of the Cambrian, the blueprint for most modern animal groups had already emerged. From the tiniest plankton to the earliest vertebrates, these pioneering creatures laid the foundation for all the diversity that would follow. The seas, once silent and shadowed, had become a grand experiment in life's potential, a thriving, ever-changing theatre where evolution's creativity first truly took flight. As the Cambrian era gave way to the Ordovician, roughly 485 million years ago, the oceans continued their transformation into thriving, intricate ecosystems. Sea levels rose and flooded broad continental shelves, creating shallow, sun-drenched habitats that wrapped around the ancient landmasses. Warm waters lapped across vast coastlines, carrying nutrients that nourished an expanding diversity of life. Coral-like organisms, along with early sponges and algae, began to construct the first massive reef systems, true underwater metropolises of limestone and living tissue. These early reefs stretched for miles, offering shelter and feeding grounds for an array of species. Trilobites remained common, but new groups of mollusks, brachiopods, and echinoderms appeared, adding layers of complexity to the seafloor community. Crinoids, sometimes called sea lilies, anchored themselves to rocks and waved delicate feathery arms to catch drifting plankton, turning quiet seabeds into shimmering gardens. In the open water, tiny planktonic organisms flourished, forming the foundation of a food web that reached new levels of abundance. Their blooms not only fed larger creatures but also altered the planet's chemistry, drawing carbon from the atmosphere and depositing it as limestone on the seafloor. This subtle process began to shape the global climate, cooling the Earth and preparing the stage for future ice ages. Among the most impressive newcomers were the nautiloid cephalopods, ancestors of today's squid and octopuses. These sleek predators, some stretching several meters long, propelled themselves through the water with jet-like bursts, their tentacles armed to capture trilobites and other prey. They became the first true apex hunters of the deep, adding a new dynamic to marine life, the pursuit of prey through speed, intelligence, and stealth. Life in the Ordovician seas was not only abundant but beautiful, with colourful reefs, swaying crinoid forests, and schools of shell-covered creatures drifting through clear waters. The oceans had matured into vibrant, balanced ecosystems, showcasing the resilience and creativity of evolution. This period was a golden age for marine life, a time of expansion and innovation, when the foundations of many modern oceanic communities were laid across the planet's flooded shelves. The Ordovician world, while seemingly serene, was already in quiet motion toward dramatic change. Continents such as Gondwana drifted southward, nudging the planet's climate toward a slow, steady cooling. Glaciers began to form in the far reaches of the southern hemisphere, their silent growth lowering sea levels and subtly reshaping coastlines that had once been broad and shallow. Yet for millions of years the seas remained a spectacle of life. reef ecosystems expanded into complex underwater neighborhoods, supporting countless interactions. Filter feeders like brachiopods blanketed rocky surfaces, their symmetrical shells opening and closing with the pulse of the tides. Early jawless fish, armored in protective plates, prowled the reefs in cautious exploration, hinting at the future rise of vertebrates. Planktonic organisms, microscopic but mighty, performed unseen feats that influenced the entire planet. By capturing carbon and sinking it to the seafloor, they drew down greenhouse gases, amplifying the cooling trend. This invisible work would eventually trigger one of Earth's earliest ice ages, but for now it only added to the slow rhythm of transformation. Above these bustling communities, nautiloid predators glided like living torpedoes. Their spiral shells reflected scattered sunlight, and their tentacles stretched wide to grasp unwary prey. Each movement displayed a mastery of the marine realm, proving that intelligence and agility were as effective as armor in the game of survival. The Ordovician seas were a testament to life's capacity for innovation and balance. From the first sprawling reefs to the delicate exchanges of plankton and predators, every current and creature played a role in shaping the planet's future. It was a world of shimmering diversity, but also a reminder that even the richest ecosystems exist within the broader cycles of Earth. Cycles that bring not only abundance, but eventual upheaval. The Ordovician oceans, once warm and overflowing with life, began to feel a subtle shift that few creatures could sense. Far to the south, the vast landmass of Gondwana drifted across the polar circle, and with it came a quiet but powerful change in climate. Over countless millennia, temperatures cooled. Clouds carried more snow than rain. Glaciers crept outward, layer by layer, spreading a sheet of ice that brightened the planet and reflected the sun's warmth back into space. Sea levels, which had remained high for millions of years, started to fall. Broad continental shelves, those shallow, sunlit zones where reefs thrived, slowly emerged into frigid air. Reefs that had been underwater gardens of coral-like sponges and early bryozoans were left exposed, their delicate builders stranded as the tides retreated farther each season. Marine life adapted in fits and starts. Trilobites and brachiopods, once abundant across the seafloor, searched for deeper refuges as their habitats shrank. Some migrated toward equatorial waters where warmth lingered. Others clung to pockets of surviving reef or followed the receding coastlines into deeper basins. But as glaciers thickened and the oceans cooled, the chemistry of the water changed. Oxygen levels dropped in many regions and vast dead zones spread across the seafloor, making survival ever more difficult. Above these cold seas, storms intensified. Winds swept across newly exposed plains of ice and rock, driving nutrient-rich dust into the ocean. At first, this fueled short bursts of plankton growth, but the blooms quickly collapsed, leaving layers of organic matter that consumed even more oxygen as they decayed. Each pulse of change, falling seas, dropping temperatures, shifting currents, set in motion a cascade of stresses that rippled through every food chain. The Ordovician Ice Age had begun, and though the process unfolded over hundreds of thousands of years, in the scale of deep time it was abrupt, a sudden tightening of Earth's climate that would test life's resilience as never before. As the ice sheets advanced, they carved the landscape into vast white deserts and towering ridges of frozen water. The planet's albedo, the measure of how much sunlight is reflected back into space, rose dramatically, locking in the cold and pushing the climate into a feedback loop. More ice meant more reflected light, which meant even colder temperatures. Continental shelves that had once hosted thriving ecosystems were now bare stone under an endless winter sky. The shallow tropical seas that supported rich coral-like reefs had nearly vanished. Entire marine communities collapsed as their habitats disappeared beneath miles of ice, or were left stranded far above the freezing waters. Trilobites, those hardy survivors of earlier ages, found fewer and fewer refuges. Brachiopods and bryozoans clung to what little remained of the continental margins, while the earliest jawless fish sought deep-water sanctuaries. Even in the darkest depths, life struggled. Cold, oxygen-poor waters limited the range of many species. Vast stretches of the ocean floor became lifeless mud, a stark contrast to the bustling habitats of only a few million years before. This was one of the first truly global mass extinctions, Scientists estimate that up to 85% of marine species perished during the height of the Ordovician Ice Age. And yet, as in every chapter of Earth's history, change carried the seeds of renewal. After hundreds of thousands of years, volcanic activity slowly increased atmospheric carbon dioxide. The ice sheets began to melt, retreating toward the poles and flooding the continental shelves once more. New coastlines formed, new shallow seas spread across the planet, and with them came opportunities for survivors to diversify. In the fossil record, the Ordovician Silurian extinction stands as a stark reminder of how planetary systems can shift dramatically, and how life, though fragile, always finds a way to continue. The oceans that followed were forever changed, setting the stage for the next great experiments in evolution and paving the way for the Silurian world of rebounding reefs and resilient species. When the grip of the Ordovician Ice Age finally loosened, the world took a long breath. Glaciers retreated, sea levels rose, and warm, shallow waters once again spread across the continents. Where silence had reigned, the seas stirred back to life. Fossil beds tell the story of recovery, of ecosystems carefully piecing themselves together after catastrophe. Reefs began to rise again, though they looked different than those that had collapsed. No longer dominated by the bryozoans and corals of the Ordovician, these new reef systems were built by tabulate and rugose corals, along with stromatoporoids, sponge-like organisms that layered themselves into thick, stony mounds. Together they formed sprawling underwater structures, habitats for countless creatures. Small fish darted through their crevices, worms burrowed into their surfaces, and early mollusks grazed along their slopes. The Silurian seas were calmer than those of the Ordovician. With warmer waters and more stable climates, life had space to diversify. Trilobites rebounded, though never to their former glory. Eurypterids, giant sea scorpions, grew in size and prowled the shallows, some reaching lengths of over 2 meters. Imagine wading into coastal waters and seeing one of these massive predators scuttle past, armoured and menacing. But perhaps the most important development of the Silurian was the rise of jawed fish. Until this point, most fish had been jawless, armoured grazers that filtered or rasped their food. With the evolution of jaws came a revolution in feeding strategies. Fish could now bite, seize, and crush, opening up entirely new roles in the ecosystem. Small predators swam the reefs, testing their newfound abilities. These early jawed fish were modest in size, but they represented the first steps toward sharks, bony fish, and eventually all the vertebrates that would walk the land. At the same time, life on land was changing too. Plants, which had begun as simple moss-like patches along damp shorelines, were evolving vascular systems that allowed them to grow taller and spread further inland. Their roots held soil, their stems carried water, and their presence began to reshape coastlines. With plants came the first true terrestrial ecosystems, fragile but significant. Insects and arthropods soon followed, scuttling into these green niches. The Silurian was a period of resilience, a time when life recovered from near collapse and began to test new possibilities. From reefs reborn to jaws snapping shut for the first time, the oceans were once again alive with invention, each experiment setting the stage for the deeper transformations of the Devonian to come. Far from the warm equatorial reefs, the poles held their own quiet drama. Glaciers, though receding, still left scars of their long winter across the continents. Rivers carried fresh minerals from these melting landscapes into the seas, enriching coastal waters and fueling bursts of plankton growth. These microscopic drifters, though invisible to the naked eye, became the true architects of the Silurian oceans. They fed the smallest fish, who in turn fed the larger hunters, creating new and complex food webs that knit the seas back together. Along rocky shores, early plants continued their slow conquest of the land. Fossilized spores show that these pioneers spread farther each millennium, transforming once barren rock into thin soils where mosses and primitive vascular plants could take root. Their presence altered rainfall patterns and began the long process of drawing carbon dioxide from the air, a subtle shift that would echo across future ages. With more plant life came the first stable terrestrial habitats, and with them the earliest millipedes, scorpions, and tiny ancestors of insects. In the water, the Silurian world grew ever stranger. Eurypterids ruled as apex predators, some nearly the length of a canoe, their segmented tails propelling them with surprising speed. Early sharks, still small, slender, and unlike the formidable hunters of later eras, glided through reefs alongside jawless armoured fish. Some of these fish bore bony plates so thick that only the strongest jaws could pierce them, while others experimented with speed and agility as defences. The ocean was becoming a theatre of both armour and movement. By the close of the Silurian, life's resilience was undeniable. From the devastation of the Ordovician extinction, the planet had blossomed once more. Reefs stretched for miles, fish with true jaws prowled the currents, and the first plants held firm on land, their green shadows reaching ever farther inland. The Silurian was not just a recovery, it was a rehearsal for the next great act, the Devonian, the so-called Age of Fishes, when both sea and land would be transformed yet again. The Silurian's quiet confidence gave way to a world swelling with ambition. By the start of the Devonian, around 419 million years ago, the Earth shimmered with warm seas and rising continents. Vast reef systems, built not only by corals but also by stromatoporoids, those layered sponge-like builders, created underwater cities more extensive than any that had come before. These reefs stretched for hundreds of miles along tropical coastlines, their limestone walls riddled with passageways where fish and invertebrates darted in a kaleidoscope of motion. It was a time of experimentation and expansion. Jawed fish, once a rare innovation, now thrived in dazzling variety. Some evolved streamlined bodies built for speed, their scales reflecting shafts of sun as they sliced through the shallows. Others developed heavy armour, placoderms with bony head shields and fearsome bite plates, a design that made them the undisputed monarchs of the Devonian seas. Among them loomed Dunkleosteus, a predator as long as a small bus, capable of delivering a bite force strong enough to shatter armour and bone alike. For the first time, the oceans echoed with the silent tension of apex predators and the frantic escape of prey, yet not every creature chose the path of brute strength. The first lobe-finned fish explored a different strategy. Their muscular fins, strengthened with bones, allowed them to push off the seabed or even haul themselves briefly onto muddy flats when water grew shallow. In these awkward movements lay a quiet revolution, the blueprint for legs. Within these pioneers were the seeds of amphibians, reptiles, birds, and eventually mammals. Their hesitant forays from water to land would reshape the history of life, though they could not know the magnitude of their steps. Meanwhile, above the waves, the land itself was transforming. Primitive plants that once clung low to damp ground began to reach skyward. Early trees with woody trunks and vascular systems formed the first true forests. Their roots dug deep, anchoring soil against erosion and drawing nutrients toward the surface. These forests exhaled oxygen and inhaled carbon dioxide, slowly changing the atmosphere and with it, the climate. Their fallen leaves enriched soils, feeding an ever more complex terrestrial ecosystem. Millipedes and early insects thrived in the shaded understories, while amphibian ancestors hunted along swampy edges, venturing farther from water with each generation. The Devonian was, in every sense, an age of possibility. Oceans brimmed with predators and prey, coral palaces grew ever taller, and the continents themselves wore a thicker, greener cloak. But as always in Earth's story, abundance carried its own fragility. Subtle shifts in climate and chemistry would one day challenge this flourishing world, setting the stage for another of life's great reckonings. For now, though, the planet exhaled a long, warm breath, and life expanded into every corner it could reach. As the Devonian progressed, the tapestry of life grew ever more intricate. Rivers meandered through landscapes rich with early forests, their banks lined with towering lycophytes and seed ferns that shed spores into humid air. Insects and millipedes scuttled along the forest floor, feeding on decaying plant matter and forming the first complex land-based food webs. These terrestrial ecosystems altered not just the land, but also the seas. The spread of deep-rooted plants increased soil erosion, carrying nutrients into rivers and coastal waters. At first, this influx fueled fertile algal blooms, but in time it also created pockets of oxygen-poor water that would foreshadow the ecological challenges to come. Out in the oceans, reef systems reached a level of grandeur unseen before or since. These limestone fortresses teemed with brachiopods, trilobites, and the ever-watchful placoderms. Schooling fish darted among coral corridors while cephalopods patrolled the open water, their coiled shells shimmering like polished stone. Among them swam early sharks, sleek cartilaginous hunters that would ultimately outlast the armoured placoderms and dominate the seas for hundreds of millions of years. Each new adaptation, from sharpened teeth to swift tails, added another brushstroke to the vibrant marine mosaic. The lobe-finned fish, meanwhile, continued their quiet revolution. Some species developed rudimentary lungs, allowing them to gulp air during dry spells or when waters turned stagnant. These small evolutionary experiments would one day lead to the first tetrapods, creatures capable of sustained life on land. Imagine the sight of a lungfish ancestor wriggling through damp mud, pushing tentatively into a sunlit world of ferns and buzzing insects. Each awkward motion was a rehearsal for a future where vertebrates would stride confidently across continents. But even as the Devonian seas glittered with life and the continents turned green, signs of instability were beginning to surface. Shifts in sea level, driven by tectonic activity and changing climates, occasionally exposed reefs and disrupted ecosystems. Oxygen fluctuations in coastal waters caused periodic die-offs. Though subtle at first, these disturbances hinted at the drawn-out crisis that would eventually culminate in the late Devonian extinction. A slow, staggered event that would dismantle much of the marine splendour so carefully built over millions of years. For now, however, the Devonian remained a world of promise. The oceans thrummed with predators and prey. The forests whispered with wind through their young leaves, and life experimented boldly with new forms and strategies. It was an age poised between triumph and trial, a reminder that evolution thrives in the tension between opportunity and uncertainty. The closing chapters of the Devonian unfolded like a slow, uneasy breath. What had once been an age of extraordinary expansion, of vast coral reefs and armoured fish, began to falter in subtle, almost invisible ways. Rivers that carried nutrients from the new forests delivered more than life-giving minerals. They also brought an overload that upset the delicate chemistry of coastal seas. Algae bloomed in thick green curtains, only to die and decay, drawing oxygen from the water. Vast regions of the ocean floor turned stagnant and dark, creating dead zones where even the hardiest species struggled to survive. On land, the forests thrived at first, stretching their leafy canopies ever higher. Their roots stabilized soil and pulled carbon dioxide from the air, cooling the global climate. But this very success came at a cost. As atmospheric carbon levels dropped and temperatures cooled, glacial ice began to creep across distant continents, subtly lowering sea levels and shrinking the shallow marine habitats that had nurtured so much diversity. In the seas, the first signs of a drawn-out crisis were already clear. Coral reefs, once immense and dazzling, began to crumble. Great placoderm predators found their hunting grounds shrinking, while trilobites, those ancient survivors of earlier ages, faced new pressures that thinned their ranks. Entire families of brachiopods and ammonites dwindled as oxygen levels fell and habitats vanished. Yet the transition was far from sudden. Over millions of years, pulses of extinction came and went like an uneven tide. Some species disappeared in a geological instant, others faded more gradually, their final generations leaving only faint fossil echoes. The Devonian's long goodbye stretched over nearly 20 million years, a slow-motion collapse rather than a single cataclysm. Still, there were survivors, early sharks, nimble and opportunistic, adapted to shifting conditions, refining their streamlined bodies for speed and endurance. Lobe-finned fishes, with their air-breathing capabilities, found refuge in isolated pools and oxygen-poor lagoons. Amphibian-like tetrapods, awkward but persistent, took advantage of shallow wetlands and humid coastlines, quietly rehearsing their exodus onto land. From the vantage of deep time, the Devonian dusk was both an ending and a rehearsal for what lay ahead. It thinned the exuberant diversity of the planet, but it also prepared the stage for new players. As reefs crumbled and armoured giants vanished, ecosystems reorganized, favoring resilience and adaptability over sheer abundance. As the Devonian slipped further into twilight, the world's rhythms grew more uneven. In some regions, brief warm periods sparked temporary recoveries. Reefs tried to rebuild in scattered pockets, only to be smothered again by oxygen-starved waters. Each pulse of renewal carried the seeds of another setback, like waves that rose only to crash harder on the next tide. The continents themselves were shifting slowly but inexorably. land masses collided to form new mountain chains, altering ocean currents and weather patterns. Inland seas that had once been warm, shallow sanctuaries became unstable, prone to dramatic flooding and sudden retreat. With every tectonic lurch, habitats fractured, and the intricate food webs that had flourished for tens of millions of years grew fragile. By the Devonian's close, the great placoderms, the armoured fish that had ruled with crushing jaws, were in steep decline. Coral forests lay in rubble, their builders gone. Trilobites, once near indestructible, were fewer and weaker, struggling to find oxygen in the dim, stagnant depths. Brachiopods and ammonites, those steadfast architects of marine ecosystems, left ghostly records of their dwindling populations in the layered rocks. Yet amid the losses, life refused to surrender. Sharks continued to refine their dominance, becoming faster and more efficient hunters, a legacy that would stretch unbroken to the present day. Lobe-finned fishes explored new ecological edges, their fleshy, bone-filled fins hinting at a destiny beyond the water. Early tetrapods crept from swampy shallows onto damp earth, tentative and unsteady, but carrying within them the potential to transform the planet's story forever. This slow, drawn-out extinction reminds us that not all endings arrive with a sudden cataclysm. Some are quiet, patient, almost imperceptible in the moment, but they are endings nonetheless, eras fading into memory while the next chapter gathers strength. The Devonian dusk prepared the way for the Carboniferous, a time when forests would tower higher and vertebrates would roam with newfound confidence on land. Out of loss, evolution once again found the space to create. The Devonian's long dusk finally gave way to a striking new dawn, the Carboniferous period. Around 359 million years ago, Earth entered an age defined by towering forests, humid swamps, and an atmosphere rich with oxygen. Where reefs had collapsed and seas had quieted, vast expanses of land now came alive with a deep, damp green. Imagine walking through these primordial woodlands. Giant lycophytes, club mosses that could reach 30 metres, formed dense cathedral-like canopies. Beneath them, tree ferns and horsetails thrived, their fronds stretching toward the filtered sunlight. The air was thick and warm, heavy with moisture and the earthy scent of constant decay and renewal. Fallen logs and sprawling roots wove a living carpet across the dark forest floor. This explosion of plant life transformed the planet. Through photosynthesis, these massive forests pumped oxygen into the atmosphere at unprecedented levels. Some estimates suggest oxygen concentrations climbed as high as 35%, compared to today's 21%. This enriched air shaped every living thing. Insects, freed from the constraints of a low oxygen, grew to astonishing sizes. Dragonflies with wingspans wider than a hawk's glided among the trees. Millipedes longer than a human arm crawled through the undergrowth, feeding on layers of decomposing plant matter. The swamps and rivers of the Carboniferous became laboratories of life. Amphibians diversified, evolving into an array of forms adapted to both water and land. Some remained tied to the wetlands, while others ventured deeper into forests, testing the possibilities of a more terrestrial existence. From these early pioneers would one day emerge the reptiles, whose stronger eggs and tougher skin would open even more worlds to explore. Below the surface, in warm, shallow seas and sprawling deltas, crinoids swayed gently with the currents. Brachiopods dotted the seafloor, filtering food from nutrient-rich waters. Though marine life was not as flamboyant as the plant revolution on land, it continued to evolve in steady rhythms, weaving new links into the planet's food web. The Carboniferous forests also laid down one of Earth's most valuable legacies, coal. As trees died and fell into the stagnant wetlands, their remains were buried in oxygen-poor mud. Over millions of years, heat and pressure transformed these layers of ancient plants into the coal seams that humans would one day burn to power civilizations. Without knowing it, these forests were writing an energy-rich future into stone. This was a world of abundance and experimentation, where oxygen-filled skies encouraged size and diversity, and the lush green of endless swamps stretched across equatorial continents. But even as life flourished, subtle changes in climate and geology hinted that the Carboniferous would not last forever. Continents continued their slow drift, mountains rose, and the seeds of the next great transformation were already being sown. Deeper into the Carboniferous, the supercontinent Pangaea was slowly assembling. Vast stretches of land collided, raising mountain chains and shaping immense river systems that meandered through the endless forests. These geological shifts subtly altered air currents and rainfall, creating complex patterns of wet and dry seasons. Though the forests still thrived, their future stability was already being tested. Within the swampy lowlands, life reached extraordinary variety. Amphibians diversified into countless forms, from slender, fish-like species that barely left the water to sturdy, lizard-shaped pioneers that roamed the forest floor. Among them were early reptiles, small but significant. Their shelled eggs allowed them to lay young away from water, a quiet innovation that would change the trajectory of evolution. These first reptiles carried the blueprint for the mighty dinosaurs and mammals that would follow hundreds of millions of years later. The atmosphere, still rich in oxygen, fueled giants. Arthropods reigned supreme among the invertebrates. Imagine enormous scorpions hunting along riverbanks or dragonflies with wingspans over 2 feet gliding effortlessly above the canopy. Their size was not just a spectacle, it was a direct consequence of oxygen levels so high that their bodies could absorb air more efficiently than any modern counterpart. Beneath the still waters of coastal swamps and shallow seas, a different drama unfolded. Coral reefs remained modest, but crinoids and brachiopods covered seafloors in carpets of slow, steady life. Shoals of early sharks and bony fish moved through shadowed channels, predators in a world where lush vegetation on land was mirrored by quiet abundance below. Over millions of years, the very success of these forests began to reshape the planet's climate. The immense drawdown of carbon dioxide cooled the Earth, nudging it toward glaciation. Ice sheets advanced across the southern supercontinent of Gondwana, locking away water and lowering global sea levels. Once vast coastal swamps shrank, leaving patches of wetland isolated amid encroaching dryness. The coal forests, pillars of the Carboniferous world, started to fragment. Yet even as habitats shifted and some species declined, life's resilience remained clear. Reptiles with their hardy eggs moved inland, adapting to drier landscapes. New plants emerged, better suited to cooler, more variable climates. The evolutionary experiments of the Carboniferous had laid deep foundations, towering forests, enormous insects, the first reptiles, and the rich coal seams that would one day power human industry. By the end of this age, Earth stood transformed. The Carboniferous was both a climax of ancient green abundance and a pivot toward new eras. From its swamps came coal, from its forests came oxygen-rich skies, and from its humble reptiles came the ancestors of every land-dwelling vertebrate to come, including us. The planet had learned to breathe deeper, and life had learned to stretch further. The close of the Carboniferous opened into the Permian period, a time of profound transformation. Roughly 299 million years ago, Earth's continents were no longer scattered islands. Instead, they were gathering into a single immense landmass, Pangaea. This supercontinent stretched from pole to pole, a colossal expanse of deserts, mountains, and broad interior plains. Vast oceans surrounded it, the Panthalassa, an endless blue, and the smaller Tethys Sea, warm and teeming with life. The climate shifted toward extremes. With so much land locked into one massive continent, humid coastal regions gave way to arid interiors. Winds carried dust across endless deserts, while seasonal rains carved canyons and filled temporary lakes. Temperatures swung dramatically, scorching during the day, frigid at night. Life that had thrived in the stable wetlands of the Carboniferous now faced unpredictable seasons and harsher landscapes. Forests of tall lycophytes and giant ferns dwindled, replaced by hardier seed plants, conifers, cycads, and ginkgo-like trees that could endure dry spells. These plants spread across Pangaea, their seeds carried by wind instead of relying on constant water. The shift from spore-bearing plants to seed-bearing pioneers marked a pivotal adaptation, opening new habitats to vegetation and reshaping entire ecosystems. Among animals, reptiles truly came into their own. No longer confined to moist environments, they adapted to arid conditions and diversified into striking forms. Early synapsids, ancestors of mammals, flourished. Some were herbivorous giants like the lumbering Edaphosaurus, while others, like the saber-toothed Dimetrodon with its iconic sail-like back, became apex predators. Their physiology, including more efficient lungs and semi-warm-blooded metabolism, allowed them to roam dry landscapes where amphibians could not survive. The seas too evolved. Coral reefs rebuilt with new architects. Sponges and algae wove vast structures in shallow waters, while ammonites and nautiloids drifted gracefully in the currents. Fish and early sharks hunted along continental shelves, and strange marine reptiles, though still in their infancy, began experimenting with life in open waters. Despite these advancements, subtle signs of instability crept into the world's systems. As Pangaea grew, ocean currents changed, influencing climate patterns and oxygen distribution in the seas. Seasonal monsoons could be intense, flooding lowlands and carving networks of rivers that dried to cracked clay in dry months. For now, life adapted, even thrived, but the stage was quietly setting for future upheavals. This first half of the Permian tells a story of innovation and expansion. Plants mastered dry land, reptiles claimed dominance, and ecosystems stretched across the largest supercontinent Earth had ever seen. Yet, beneath the progress, tectonic forces and subtle climate shifts hinted that the calm was temporary. The planet was gathering strength for a transformation unlike any before. As the Permian period advanced, Pangaea's immense size amplified the planet's climate contrasts. Interior deserts grew harsher, their sands sculpted into towering dunes by relentless winds. Rivers that once carried seasonal floods dwindled into salt flats and evaporating basins. Storms swept across vast distances, and with little ocean nearby to moderate temperatures, summers scorched while winters bit with sudden cold. Life along the coasts remained more stable, but inland the world became a testing ground for adaptation. Seed plants continued their quiet conquest. Conifers, with needle-like leaves and protective cones, spread across uplands and dry plateaus. These trees could store water and withstand months without rain, reshaping landscapes that once belonged to dense swamp forests. Their fallen needles layered the soil, altering its chemistry and supporting fungi and insects adapted to these new conditions. Ferns and cycads persisted in moister valleys, but the age of spore-dominated wetlands had clearly passed. Among animals, synapsids diversified into remarkable forms. The sail-backed Dimetrodon remained a dominant predator, but other lineages emerged with traits that foreshadowed mammals: differentiated teeth for slicing and grinding, more upright stances for efficient movement, and even hints of warm-blooded metabolisms. Herbivorous pariasaurs lumbered across plains in massive herds, their bony armor protecting them from predators. Smaller insectivorous reptiles scurried through leaf litter, their sharp senses attuned to the dry open world. The oceans too held wonders and warnings. Coral reefs built by sponges and algae formed vibrant underwater cities, where fish darted and ammonites drifted in slow spirals. Yet oxygen levels in some deep waters began to fall. Subtle shifts in currents and temperature created pockets of stagnation, early signs of the instability that would one day become catastrophic. Volcanic rumblings hinted at deeper unrest. In regions that would later form Siberia, tectonic movements stretched and fractured the crust. Magma pressed upward, setting the stage for eruptions that lay far in the future but would dwarf anything life had yet witnessed. These geological preparations were silent to Permian creatures, but the Earth itself was gathering energy for a transformation on a planetary scale. For now, however, life flourished in an age of innovation. Reptiles dominated landscapes once ruled by amphibians. Forests adapted to dryness, spreading across continents in new configurations. Insects grew in diversity, some reaching remarkable sizes in the rich oxygen of the time. It was a world of both stability and subtle warning, a balancing act of evolution and environment that could not last forever. As the Permian approached its twilight, Earth stood at a crossroads. Above ground, the sun blazed over deserts and hardy forests. Beneath, magma slowly pooled in hidden chambers. The stage was set for the next great drama, a mass extinction so profound it would reset the trajectory of life. But in these last vibrant chapters, the planet celebrated resilience, plants that conquered drought, reptiles that mastered land, and seas that shimmered with ancient life. The close of the Permian period was unlike anything Earth had ever experienced. For hundreds of millions of years, life had endured ice ages, meteor impacts, and slow continental shifts. But nothing prepared the planet for the cataclysm that followed. Deep within the crust of what is now Siberia, the Earth began to rupture. Vast fissures opened, releasing torrents of lava across an area larger than modern Europe. These eruptions, known today as the Siberian Traps, lasted for hundreds of thousands of years. Rivers of molten rock spread across the land, while towering columns of ash and gas turned skies dark for months at a time. First came cooling. Ash clouds blocked sunlight, dropping global temperatures and disrupting seasons. Forests withered, food chains weakened, and oceans began to change. Then came the opposite, a surge of carbon dioxide and methane that wrapped the planet in a greenhouse blanket. Temperatures soared to levels lethal for many species. The seas grew warmer, oxygen thinned, and vast areas turned anoxic, dead zones where fish and coral could no longer survive. Hydrogen sulfide gas seeped from stagnant depths, poisoning marine life and even drifting into the air above. Coral reefs, once rich and complex, collapsed entirely. Trilobites, creatures that had survived for more than 270 million years, vanished forever. On land, life fared no better. Forests burned and deserts spread. Insects, once the great survivors, faced their first mass extinction. Synapsids and other reptilian ancestors of mammals dwindled, their numbers slashed by the relentless swings of heat and cold. Only the smallest, most adaptable creatures found refuge in burrows or along shifting coastlines. By the time the eruptions finally waned, over 90% of marine species and 70% of land species were gone. The Permian-Triassic extinction, the Great Dying, was the most severe loss of life the planet has ever recorded. It erased entire ecosystems, leaving behind a quiet, barren Earth. And yet, life did not end. A handful of synapsids endured, carrying the seeds of the mammalian line. Certain fish, insects, and hardy plants persisted, ready to rebuild when conditions softened. The planet itself, scarred but not defeated, began its long healing. From this silence would rise the Triassic world, a new stage where dinosaurs would emerge and new forests would grow. But the memory of the Great Dying remains etched in rock, a stark reminder of how fragile, even temporary, the balance of life can be. As the Earth struggled through those dark millennia, the recovery was painfully slow. For millions of years, landscapes lay bare beneath a sun veiled in haze. Rivers ran through plains of ash, carrying minerals that once nourished thriving forests. The oceans, choked with hydrogen sulfide and stripped of oxygen, remained eerie and still. Yet even in this quiet desolation, the stubborn spark of life refused to fade. Ferns and mosses were among the first to reclaim the land, their spores settling in volcanic soil warmed by the fading fires. Tiny burrowing creatures emerged from hidden refuges, surviving on whatever meagre plants could grow. These humble pioneers began to weave the first fragile webs of a new ecology. Slowly, rainfall washed carbon dioxide from the skies, cooling the fevered planet. Rock weathering absorbed greenhouse gases, and over millions of years the atmosphere regained a gentler balance. Shallow seas formed again, inviting new generations of corals and shellfish to experiment with life. The descendants of the few surviving fish diversified, exploring empty niches and beginning the long evolutionary climb toward new forms. On land, the ancestors of mammals crept through fern thickets, while the earliest archosaurs, relatives of future dinosaurs, found opportunity in the silence. Each small victory of survival was a step toward the Triassic, where a radically reshaped world awaited. The Great Dying left scars deeper than any event before or since. It proved that even the most dominant life can be undone when planetary systems spin beyond balance. But it also revealed the extraordinary patience of Earth. Given time, the same planet that had nearly emptied itself of life became fertile again, ready for new experiments. Every stone layer from that era carries a quiet lesson. Collapse is possible, yet renewal is certain. From the brink of nothingness, the stage was set for the next act. The rise of dinosaurs, new forests, and the intricate diversity that would follow. The planet's slow heartbeat quickens as the Triassic dawns. Where silence once ruled, new sounds begin to echo across plains and shallow seas. The atmosphere steadies, clouds gather, and gentle rains feed soils enriched by ancient ash. Ferns and cycads spread green carpets across lowlands, while hardy conifers stretch skyward in scattered forests. Tiny reptiles, descendants of survivors, scurry between roots and along rocky outcrops. Their bodies are lean, their senses sharp, perfectly adapted to a world rebuilding itself. Some are insect hunters, others small plant eaters, all testing the fresh opportunities carved from devastation. Among them are the early archosaurs, agile and resilient, distant ancestors of creatures that will one day dominate the continents. In the recovering seas, ammonites unfurl elegant spiral shells, gliding through waters once empty. Marine reptiles like the swift nothosaurs and early ichthyosaurs begin to prowl the coastal shallows, their sleek forms a new kind of grace. Corals slowly return, forming modest reefs that hint at the vibrant oceans to come. Each tide carries plankton blooms that sparkle beneath the light of a healing sun, proof that life's cycle has resumed. Volcanoes still rumble in distant ranges, but their violence now builds mountains instead of ending worlds. Rivers cut through the new terrain, their sediments laying fresh layers of stone that will one day tell this story to those who listen. The air hums with insects, their wings catching the soft dawn light, a quiet chorus of renewal. Everywhere, the lesson of resilience is written in motion and colour. The great dying has passed, and the earth shows that even after the deepest darkness, life can return, reimagine, and rise again. As the Triassic ages unfold, the survivors of the Permian cataclysm diversify in dazzling ways. Archosaurs, those nimble reptiles of the plains, branch into early dinosaurs and the ancestors of modern birds and crocodiles. Small bipedal species such as Chelophysis run lightly across floodplains, their hollow bones and quick reflexes perfect for a world of shifting climates and sudden floods. Nearby, the first pterosaurs take to the skies, leather-winged silhouettes gliding across crimson sunsets, scouting for insects over newly formed lakes. On land, lush ferns and towering conifers form forests where cycads and ginkgos flourish. Each rainfall brings the scent of resin and fresh growth, while insects buzz in an increasingly complex web of life. Tiny mammal-like synapsids, ancestors of future mammals, scuttle through the underbrush, sharp-eyed and opportunistic, living in the shadows of the rising reptiles. Their keen senses and warm-blooded metabolisms give them quiet advantages that will echo far into the future. Beneath the waves, reefs expand and harden. Ichthyosaurs evolve into swift oceanic hunters, while placodonts browse on shellfish in shallow lagoons. Ammonites spiral outward in ornate shells, marking the rhythms of the sea with their intricate designs. The oceans, once nearly lifeless, now pulse with colour and motion, a living counterpoint to the barren silence that followed the Permian disaster. Slowly, Pangaea begins to fracture, birthing rift valleys and new coastlines. These tectonic shifts create microclimates and fertile deltas that invite further diversification. The planet itself seems to breathe easier, trading the harsh extremes of earlier epochs for a more balanced warmth. This is the true dawn of the Mesozoic, a time of rebuilding and innovation. From the scattered survivors of the greatest extinction, Earth fashions a new and extraordinary biosphere. It is the stage on which the dinosaurs will rise to unmatched dominance, where mammals will bide their time, and where the oceans will shimmer with unfamiliar wonders. From the brink of silence, the world has composed a symphony of life once more, proving that renewal is not a miracle but a steadfast rhythm of our planet.